So today,
Now you can start.
okay.
Had to check you a little bit there.
Just making sure everything's working right. Well, welcome to our brainstorming human connections. And today we're going to be talking about language. And of course, language is a primary connector between people. It's one of the ways that people connect with each other. Probably the most obvious or the most used way that people try to communicate and connect with each other. I think one can, question how effective it is based on the things that we want to communicate, but we can say it's one that we depend on. And we can say that with pretty good confidence, I think. If someone disputes that, I'm always open to hearing new ideas on it. Let's talk a little bit about language. What do you think is the most spoken language in the world? What do you think? Any guesses? It's not exactly a trick question.
Well, English is a pretty common business language, obviously, internationally. So if you travel, a lot of places will speak English. And then there's a whole lot of Chinese people. So I'm guessing Mandarin is up there as well. Just guessing.
Okay, those are two very good guesses because English is the most widely spoken language and the language that has the most speakers, okay, period. Mandarin is the language that has the most native speakers, okay, because there are just so many people, and it's also the central language in China, and other people people in China speak other languages in China, but Mandarin is the central language and therefore the language that has the most native speakers. Right up there with English and Chinese is Hindi, which we don't really think about that much, but there's a lot of people who speak Hindi. And there's actually quite a few people who are non-native speakers of Hindi. Then there's Spanish, and Spanish doesn't have as many non-native speakers as does Hindi, but it's right up in there, and it's pretty widespread too. Now, the spreading of English and Spanish was mostly through conquest and colonization, because at one time they were the countries that had the most colonies, and they were the countries who were most intent on making people like them. And so they had a good start on suppressing the languages of the colonies that they created, and trying to make people forget their own culture and become whoever the dominant culture was, whether they were Americans or English or various forms of Spanish. Now the interesting thing about I don't know about Mandarin so much because Mandarin hasn't spread so far beyond its borders. This has quite a few people who speak Mandarin outside, but most of the concentration is going to be in China, and depending on your politics, Taiwan. But in the case of English and Spanish, one of the more interesting things that have happened is the dispersion of the language in the form of dialects, okay, and different accents. And I say dialects slash accents because things usually start off as accents, slang, and that kind of thing, and morph into dialects, and eventually into whole other languages, as happened with Latin, okay, where Latin was spoken, from conquest. But the problem, the thing with learning language as a result of conquest is that people have a tendency to still want to be who they are. And so there's a, how do they say, a graduation to the mean or something like that. It's like you may force the people to speak only a certain language, but then they have different feelings and they have different experiences. So that language, as you speak it, doesn't resonate. It's hard for them to express things. And so at least between themselves, they start to morph the language. And they often have mouth structures and muscles that you develop from your native language, the thing that you first start learning. And then that tends to sort of determine or morph how you speak the second, third, or fourth language. So that what you have is first a lot of accents, and then over time, if the culture goes away, like the Romans went away, then a whole new language starts up because people have a way of culturalizing even their language that they were oppressed into learning. And many of them had forgotten the languages that they knew before, or in many cases, they were like localized, we can say tribal languages that people spoke, and they might not have been more than 5,000-10,000 people who spoke that language. Then Latin becomes the lingua franca, or the language that's between all of them. And you can see that a lot in places like Africa, where you'll still have recently decolonized places. So people will start to speak their own languages again more. But as they do, they find that the borders that were drawn were not drawn around their culture. They were drawn for the convenience of those previous colonizers. And so those people have a hard time communicating with each other based on their own tribal language. So in order to have a government, they start to use whatever the previous colonial language was, because one, usually they have a lot of business relationships with those former colonists. And a lot of the official ways that they learned to organize their government had to do with ideas that came from those former colonists. And so the way that they organized their hospitals or civil service or even their fire departments and stuff tend to be learned in a foreign language. So if you're going to learn anything other than what you do in your culture, if you're going to go cross-culture, and certainly if you're going to leave the country at all, you're going to have another language other than your tribal language. It's just that simple, because, look, there's over 7,000 languages currently spoken, and they're dying off all the time. But there's over 7,000 languages that are currently spoken in the world. And most people are not going to learn yours if you're a tribal language. They're just not, And if you go to a national conference or a university where other information and knowledge is being exchanged, you had better know some other kind of language. It might be Spanish. Likely it's going to be English as a default one, because there's so many books that are published in English compared to other languages. And also so much of information is in English that it almost becomes the default international language, even though, for my taste, it's a clumsy clumsy one, because English, once you start thinking about English and you start comparing it to other languages, you realize it's a ridiculous language. You know, I mean, the grammar structure, the spelling, the idioms, the contradictions in terms and all kinds of things. It's a horrible language structurally, you know. So, but unfortunately, we're kind of stuck with it until somebody comes up with another thing. But I will say this for the proliferation of English. It has absorbed more words from other cultures than probably any other language in the world, you know. So no matter what language you speak, you know, there's a pretty good chance that at least one or two words that are in the English dictionary comes from your language, you know, because there are a lot of things, I hope we'll discover here, there are a lot of things that can't be said in whatever native language you have. Okay, whatever your native language is, whether it's English, Spanish, Urdu, or whatever, there are things that you cannot say in your language. Why? Because language builds up around mutually shared experiences. That's how we develop language. And so if we don't have an experience, there's no reason to express it, so we don't have a word for that. But if we do have something that we all experience and we want to communicate and exchange information about that, then we come up with a word, we come up with a way to express that thing, you know. So as a result, languages are very, let's say, I hate to use the word insular, but it's like you kind of have to be with people to speak it. And that's important here because even when you natively speak a language, if you don't have mutual experiences around that language and share it with people, what you'll notice is a sort of linguistic drift. And that is to say that little by little, native speakers will use the same word, but have different meanings and different ideas of what you're talking about. And we can certainly see that today as we communicate with more people that we don't know across lines that we didn't know existed. We can start to see that some people have words that they have a different meaning, and some people have words that are triggered meanings. In other words, like there's history attached to that, and the other person who's also a native speaker, they never experienced that, and so that's not a thing for them. And in one word, something is a term of endearment, and one person, the same native speakers, one case it's a term of endearment, and in another case or situation, it's an insult, you know. But if we all are, you know, communicating with each other every day, then that tends not to happen so much. Right? So with that kind of short primer on language, I have a few questions to throw out, and I hope everybody will participate. Anybody who wants to, you know, because that's what we like to see, participation in these things and exchange ideas. I want to start to share some things with you, and one of the questions that I had was, do you see that languages are being lost as different generations pass through time? We know that we're losing languages, you know, we can count those. But as even in one language, let's say if you fast forward 50 years, do you find that there are gaps in communication and linguistic or using words when you communicate with younger people or people who are in another generation than you do? Have any of you experienced that? Anybody? Go ahead, Betty.
I have worked in the 2 or 3 places I can think of where I guess the first example and easiest to explain is when I went to work in a small nursing home in a small community here in South Dakota that was formed of Germans from Russia. And the nursing home was really small. The people who lived there and worked there were literally family for the most part. So it was an easy place to see 3 generations in the same place and hear them communicate. And it was in that place where I could say the older people grew up speaking only German early on, but they did not teach it to their children. They were kind of suppressed because of the political situation of the world at that time. And then those children went to school speaking German with English only speaking. And I think what happened over that generation and the next was that much of the German was just left to the old people. And then perhaps as they got older, they start to realize that the 3rd generation and the 4th generation had not had that exposure. And then some of them started to see the value and want to reclaim it. And I saw similar things happening when I worked out in the Yakima Valley with people who had migrated and stayed from primarily Mexico and had been raised speaking Spanish, and the same kind of thing happens. So it doesn't just all of a sudden disappear, but it dwindles.
And I think you talked a little bit about it, but if you could expand a little bit, Betty, on what kind of pressures sort of encourage younger people to abandon a language that's basically their first tongue.
Well, I would say in the Yakima Valley, the ones that I worked with as coworkers, they had a desire to fit in, a strong desire to be part of the culture, so to speak, of the Yakima Valley, which was a lot of people from a lot of places, but they wanted to be fashionable. They wanted to be hip to culture, movies, TV shows to talk about. And so I think there was and then going to school, which, yeah, I guess a lot of the ladies that I worked with had gone to school in California before they ended up living in Yakima. But I think it's that kind of thing where they want to be part of their age peer group, not necessarily their language peer group.
That brings about some interesting things that I don't know whether we should delve into it here, but at this point, but certainly something that's interesting to explore, and that is how language is used to fill connections, that it's more than the words. But we'll get into that. But before we do, I'd like to talk a little bit more, if others have an idea about what's lost, even when you're speaking the same language. Let's assume for the moment that, the language, people are still speaking the language, at least between them. Let's take English, for example. As far as I know, English isn't a dying language, but do you see anything, have you experienced that over time, there is, let's say, less understanding or confusion in terms of speaking a language or communicating in a language? Are there things that you find that are more difficult to say, or that maybe not difficult, stress-wise, but difficult in the sense that you say something and people have no idea what you're talking about, and you feel it's generational?
I think, or what I've noticed is that in particular with English, because there's a plasticity kind of to English that because it's used everywhere, that cultures adopt it and use it, you know, as an identifier. So if I'm, you know, if I'm in back home and someone says, oh yeah, you know, I'm driving up to Pierre tomorrow, that inflection tells me immediately that they're not from the region. They're not from the state. They're not from the region. That's my identifier. If someone says it correctly, then they get like a you know, a 50% plus pass.
They get a
and they
bonus.
might be from around this place. But that includes all forms of, I mean, that's just a very, you know, that's a nuanced thing, but that exists across all cultures. And because English is so universally used, it's become more acceptable that way. In fact, there was some book that we read here a couple of years ago for a book club I was in that talked about that English will probably remain, you know, like the dominant global language, but it will not be the English that's around today. It's a modified English that will get rid of a lot of what you talked about. The grammar rules will be out the window, and they're already out. If you live where I live, or you know where I work here, you hear that, and people adopt the more open grammar rules, where you know grammar schmammer kind of thing, and by doing that, they actually find more in common.
Yes.
You know, it's less isolating than you follow the rules. And so what I find usually with English, what you talk about, you know, generational gaps and cultural gaps, absolutely. We use it to identify ourselves, whether we know it or not.
Mhm.
One of the first things when I went to college, you know, eons ago, was I didn't think I had any kind of accent. And I remember these guys coming to me and going, hey, Todd, how is it back home in South Dakota? And, you know, and I would use occasional words that they go, what are you talking about? And I really didn't believe I had an accent. I was very sorely mistaken.
Yes.
But even the words I use, if I use a word like outfit to talk about a truck, they would just like, you know, just like, who am I talking to here? But that exists, I think, for everyone in some form. There's not like a neutral form of it. So we identify ourselves that way. It's not just by generational gap and new things come into language. It is that as well. I mean, you know, text speak and, you know, listening to my kids speak, there's stuff I don't understand what they're saying, but I will stop them and ask them. But I mean, it's across culture, it's across geographic region, it's all kinds of things.
Yes, I've seen the same kind of thing, Todd, in terms of, you know, different countries, people from region to region, they speak different. In fact, there in Japan, the area I live in, we have our local dialect is called Shonai Ben or Shonai accent. It's not quite accented because we even have different grammar rules, you know, like the way that we speak to each other. But then there's a national language that's like the broadcast Japanese. That's the one you learn in school. Okay, that's the Japanese that you learn in school. And that's the Japanese that you should be able to go every place in Japan and be understood by Japanese, because that's whatever Ben you spoke at home, if you go to work for NHK, a Japanese broadcasting company, you are going to use, in most cases, you're going to use the I call it a broadcast accent, and the way that they speak, kind of like a New York Times kind of, you know, reference of like, this is where you put the commas and stuff. But occasionally they will have like characters on the show that they will speak from a different, they will speak a dialect to indicate this person has this kind of attitude, you know, this person is, like in my area, it's like a farming area, okay? And our accent is so unique that it becomes a caricature. So you'll have TV programs where they will have one character, let's say on a talk show, that he always uses show night man. In fact, they had an American on there once, and he was kind of like, he got to be like a kind of a national icon because he spoke show night man on TV, and he was clearly not born in show night. But even the people from Shona just said, he's got it down, he got the accent down, So I think that that's important to mention because it speaks to how much we use language as identity, and I'm just curious, have you, any of you had examples of, can share examples of where you have found language being used as identity or as an identifier, that you believe in something, or you come from a certain place, or you're in a certain age group or a religion or something like that? Can you think of examples?
Hi, this is Annie.
Yeah, go ahead, Annie.
Yeah, hi. I'm in my pajamas, so that's why I'm not on the screen. I live in Rapid City. I'm new to this conversation, but I've been, looking forward to coming to these conversations for a long time.
Welcome.
And thank you. An issue of language that came up in my work, I work as a folklorist and work with, people who are working in the arts that reflect their own history and background. And there's a gentleman, I came from Wyoming recently, a gentleman in Wyoming who is a Basque musician. So he plays a Basque accordion. He's, well revered. He's invited to all sorts of Basque events and festivals. But he married a woman whose mother married a Basque gentleman. So his spouse had a stepdad who was Basque. So several steps removed from, Basque family heritage and history. And he explained to me, so there was this issue of identity and, he not being from Basque, but kind of coming into the Basque community. And it's very strong that he moved into it. He lived in Buffalo, Wyoming, which is extremely, has a large Basque background. But he said that when he goes back to the old country and plays there, he's accepted as Basque because he speaks their language. Not just the language of music, which is so important, but he has taken the time to learn their specific language. So his argument is that he is authentically Basque because one of the Basque definitions of their culture is a language speaker. And I just thought that was really fascinating, the importance of language on national identity.
Yes, very much. Yeah, and we can see that how it plays out. Because, if you keep thinking that, the brain actually wants to do things the easiest way in most cases. It will play puzzles and stuff like that, but it looks for shortcuts. That's kind of how it rolls. And if you have to do full processing on language, that's a lot of work for the brain to do. And so it takes shortcuts. And so the easier you make it for somebody to understand you linguistically, the more they feel like, oh, I like this person, and the harder, even if they have other reasons to like you, if it's hard for them to understand your accent or I understand what you say, but I don't know what you mean, that kind of thing, they start to look for reasons why not to like you, and to me, I attribute it to brain fatigue. It's like or we can say laziness, but that's just kind of how the brain rolls. It doesn't really, for most people, they don't want to get involved in all of that processing. They want it to be easy. And so that's why a lot of what we say to each other is parroting, because if I say, how's the weather? And you already know the response, or how you doing, you already know the response. You don't even have to think about it. You just sort of like, your mouth starts moving and just, starts making the sound that goes with how you doing. Fine. Even if you've just found out you have cancer and your leg's going to rot off next week, where you say, fine.
I think that example, sorry to interrupt, but
Yeah, go ahead.
in terms of, national identity in the Basque that are, their language comes, has its own root language and history. Very, very difficult to understand, because we can't use patterns from our own, English to come into it. So it makes it a stronger argument that the Basque would use language as an identifier, and also not having, a home country. They live between Spain and France, but have a strong national identity. That language, would be. I could see how language is elevated to be, national icon. I guess that's the wrong word, but so strongly in their part of identity. And it's interesting to me that they would then be comfortable allowing people who speak the language fluently, even as a foreign national, to be brought into the fold because of how difficult it is. They you prove yourself by taking the time to learn this very difficult language.
Yeah, you prove yourself. And there's another part of it too. They feel like you, when people hear you speak, especially if you speak it well, there's a two-part thing to it, I find. One, there's a certain, if you don't really look like you're Basque, like like let's say if I spoke Basque, there would be a kind of like, the head doesn't know quite what to do with that. And I can tell you lots of stories like that in Japan, but I've seen it in other cultures as well. But then once you get over that first initial, like, what's wrong with this picture, then there's a sort of acceptance of like, it's easy to deal with, and you get invited to places and you get invited to do things, and people include you in a way that they don't do even other Japanese. In fact, I had a guy once who was it was one of my English students, and he said, I don't know how you get along with people so well here. He said, I'm Japanese, but he came from Osaka, and he said, I'm Japanese, and people don't accept me here. They accept my wife because she's Shonai, but they don't, somehow they don't, I can't, they don't accept me, And I think I found that in other places too, where like when people feel a certain kind of connection to you because you say things the same way they do, that goes a long way, I think. Can you think of any other examples of where language is identity? Any examples? How about in the US?
I've had opportunity to spend time among deaf and learn some American Sign Language, and used it somewhat in some of my job situations. And that's a really tight-knit community around sign language. But I found that even my meager efforts to engage in conversation were much appreciated. And then they would accommodate me, slow way down, spell words that I didn't know the signs for, and that sort of thing. It was really interesting. It is a language of its own and a culture. I think it's very tightly connected.
Yeah. And again, it's on that mutual experience. You have a strong mutual experience being deaf, even if you're from a whole different part of the world. I knew this one friend who she was Japanese, but she grew up in France, but she was very Japanese. I guess her parents were like diplomats or business people or something. But at any rate, she was deaf, and she came to the US, and she could fit right in with a deaf culture, because they had such mutual experiences. And even though they had a different kind of sign language, she explained this, it was kind of like a different dialect of sign language. But even with that, there was this connection, that of shared mutual experiences that kind of drove their language and identity. Any others? Examples of identity and culture being hooked to language. Jace?
Well, when I think of sign language, I think of Plains Indian people, Plains Native people, because we're usually given credit for developing native sign language. And different tribal groups will say, well, the Kiowa did it first, or the Lakota did it first, or whatever. But the idea is that it was a way for those tribal people to communicate with one another. And there are a few speakers of sign language today, and I know a few signs, but it's kind of a way of communicating. Folks wanted to be able to trade with one another and have a connection in that way. But my mother was an English major when she went to school, and she chose English because she wanted to know and better understand the non-natives that she's going to be working with, and also because she went into teaching. She was a teacher, and she wanted to be able to speak correct English and to share that with her students. But and so that kind of trickled down to my sister and I, because when she would when we would say things like vernacular use of language, like "and it, isn't that right?" "And it," that used to really make her angry. Speak correct English. And I said, well, we used to just love teasing her and using, slang and stuff, because she worked so hard to learn the English language, because her first language was Lakota. And that's and she was so happy that she was able to learn English so well. And then we would kind of tease her about that, especially. And I know that was kind of mean, but in our own language, we have 3 dialects: Lakota, Dakota, and Nakota. And they say that the first dialect was Dakota, D. And so there's a little bit of rivalry. It's good rivalry, though. They tease one another about the different dialects and the different ways that words mean different things in different dialects. And like, for example, in Lakota, if you say that you're Kuja, and if you're from Standing Rock, if you say you're Kuja, that means that you're like kind of more mentally ill. But if you say you're Kuja amongst the Oglala Lakota people on the Pine Ridge Reservation, they'll think, oh, you're ill, you're physically ill. And so you have to be careful how you use the language, because it makes a difference. When you're mentally ill amongst the people, the Oglala Lakota people, they say that you're with Gotgotka, or you're crazy with go. And so all these different dialectical difference, depend on, what reservation you are at. You can tell how they're speaking. but you can also tell them the way that they relate to one another in terms of the different, the dialects. And I think that's fascinating. I love that. I think it's fun. And I love it when people speak their own language and they share their language with us, because you see the world through your language. And you like, for example, there's a Lakota word for, our Lakota word for children is Wakaeja. Wakaeja. So that means sacred beings. And so if you look at children as sacred beings, that gives you a different mental set of how you relate to those young ones. If you call them sacred beings and you believe that, that's how you treat them. So I think language is really important to people, and not only in communication, but how your mindset and how you view the world. So I think it's wonderful that when people speak other languages, and I get excited. When I taught school, that's one of the first things I would ask my students: do any of you speak a different language in here? And because I like to hear about the differences and about their lives. That kind of gave me an idea of where they were coming from and who they are. So language and identity is very inextricably intertwined. So I love language.
Yeah. Well, thank you a lot for that, Jace, because that really cuts to some of the whole purpose of this conversation, is to kind of draw that out so that we start to get a deeper sense of how language is more than just a communication tool. I mean, talking about our cultures, that's communication too, but it has a lot more to do with how we feel, and as Jace pointed out, how we see the world, and it shapes how we see the world. And it's funny how something that logically we know is not true, but we start to feel it's true when we say it in an idiom, like, for example, people will say, oh, that person has such and such a kind of blood, Russian blood or something like that. And you would think, okay, logically, we know, at least I know, that there's no such thing as Russian blood. You can't go to the hospital and say, oh, this guy needs a transfusion. Can you go find some Russian blood? They don't have it, because, and you can do transfusion across all these different lines, but many people, they take that literally. In fact, one of the odd things, like in World War II, there were soldiers who died on the battlefield because they didn't want a transfusion of any Black blood, literally died. Even though the Red Cross says, hey, look, there's like A, B, there's no, they weren't having it. It's almost like vaccines, it's like they weren't having it, that you're not going to trick me. And then I go back home and then, people are going to treat me different because I got this Black blood. Nope, rather die, So language has a lot to do with how we see the world, how we frame it. Any other examples before we move on to the next part of this? Any other? Okay, so I think one of the things that we could go to at this point is, how do we start to use language, or what are some of the ways that we might start to use language to expand our ideas, expand how we see the world. I think Jace made some points along those lines about how important and how she got value out of it. And if Jace, if you have more to say on that, I'm certainly all ears. But what are some ways that knowing other languages can help us see some other part of, or some other reality, some other part of the world that we wouldn't otherwise been aware of. Anybody?
Well, there's one thing, and you had touched upon this a little already, so I don't want to get into it too deeply, but there are idioms and words that don't exist, right?
Mm.
So a lot of times that lets you into a knowledge of, like, how a certain culture or people from an area will, how they not just act, it's kind of, how they have come to be that way. So there's a word in Arabic that's very popular. I love the word. And there's really not a word for it in English, although you can fit some stuff in it. It's halas, halas, or khalas, or however you say halas.
Mhm.
It's used in a bunch of different ways. In Arabic, it kind of means that's it, that's all, but it's more than that. It's to punctuate a communication between people. It's the period or the exclamation point or the ellipsis sometimes, because it goes on and on and on. A lot of times people will use it like, I want to get out of this conversation, so you'll hear them say it like 6, 7 times. Halas, hala, okay, tayab, halas, and you can tell that one out. But other times it's like to say, it's like shaking someone's hand saying deal, but in a conversational form.
Yes.
And, I find that really good, because a lot of times there's an uncomfortable part in communication that doesn't close, an interaction. And because of that, the call to action, whatever it is, just even if it's just in a friendship or something, is somewhat lost, because you're having to go back through a conversation saying, well, we did talk about this, but did we really think about this? And you get to an end of a conversation to a point where, like, that moment happens, like the call to action happens. Halas is sure to follow very shortly thereafter, even if the conversation goes on. So kind of what that person understood as being the most important part of that conversation. We don't have that really in English, and I love that concept, but there's really not a way to do it. It doesn't exist.
Right.
So I know this about Arabic here anyway, how it's used, is that it was a transactional use of speech, whether it was friendship, because you had different tribes meeting and you had different cultures coming together in certain parts. And that was the way to say, okay, that's the meaning. That's what we understand. That's the deal. So, I see that, but a lot of times it's those idioms, it's the terms that you pick up and you go, well, what is that? And that gives you insight into a people, kind of how they came about and how they continue to be, just through how they communicate, just simple words or phrases sometimes.
But in French, we have a word d'accord, we use it pretty much like you use halas, and that's a very good example, Todd, of like a way where if we understand that, and if we understand the meaning of that word, and we don't have a way to say that, then it gives us an insight into another way of thinking. One of my favorite ones in Japanese, and there are many, but one of my favorite one is the word kaminari. And kaminari is both lightning and thunder, because the Japanese don't see it as two different things. They see it as one event. But we, even though if you ask people, they say, yeah, the lightning is different than thunder. But they don't really see that it's the same. We don't feel it as the same event. We see it as two different things that are connected, rather than one thing that we look at in different, or we experience in two different ways. And the language, I think, is an example of how the language reflects that. Any other examples of how knowing another language can expand how we see the world, or how you've experienced something as a result of a different language or a different word that you learned?
When
Jace?
you said thunder and lightning, we only have one word for thunder and lightning as well. It's wakia.
Mhm,
And so it's depending on how you use it and
mhm,
how, what context you use it, then, specifically if they're talking about the voice of thunder, the booming, or the
mhm,
lightning, the eyes of wakia,
mhm,
the flash. So that's one example as well. But when I think of the different ways that we look at, like another example for another word would, and that's what I like about the language, because it delves, it gives you a deeper meaning into the culture of the people and how they view the world. For example, the Lakota word for children is wakaja.
mhm,
So waka has different meanings, but it means like sacred or holy, mysterious. It's kind of hard to define because it is so mysterious. But wakayeja, it's like beings, sacred beings. So if we think of our children as sacred beings, then we treat them as such. And so the words that you use are very precious and are very important, and you just don't use them lightly. Another word I think that is very important that some people kind of banter around is the word kola, Kola.
mhm,
Kola means a male friend. So another male would say that to another male person, that you are my kola. But not only are you my kola, my friend, but you are the friend that I would die for. So it has a very deep meaning that you are so close to that person that you would give your life for that person.
mhm,
So you don't say that lightly. You don't say that, you don't call somebody your kola if you are not willing to die for them. And the same thing is, there's another word for the women. You have the word too. We say mashke. So if I am close to another woman, that I am willing to die for her, and to take her place if she dies, to be the mother to her children. And so it's really a deeper connection to that person versus saying just a friend. You're careful of the words that you use, because they have a much deeper meaning than that. So those that know the language then know, they're careful, then if they use that word, then they'd be prepared to back it up with what you, if you say that. Otherwise you'll say your relationship to that person. So if that is your older sister or your younger sister or your older brother or younger brother, or your relative, how you relate to them, then that's how you would probably refer to them. I think it's really neat that a lot of our, then Lakota language anyway, there's a lot of interpersonal relationships and how we refer to one another as relatives. And that's, we use that more than their names actually. And certainly we don't use their Lakota names or sacred names. We'll use their name as how we're related to them, like cousin or younger brother, or however we refer to them as a relative. I know a lot of times today people will say the two words that are like the catch-all words, and it's not an amen, but a lot of people will use it as that. It's mitakuye oyasi, mitakuye oyasi, and it means for all my relatives, or it means we are all related, or everything is related to one another. But mitakuye oyasi are very sacred words in my opinion, and those should be used when you want to encompass everything in your universe as your relative. So if you say mitaku yeoyase, again, you should be able to back that up with your actions and your words and your behavior. If you say that you are related to everything in the universe, then you treat everything in the universe in that manner. So it's not just an amen or that's how it is. You know, it's a very, those are very two sacred words, I think, that shouldn't be bantied about, but should be used in the way that they were meant to be used. So it kind of just, you know, depends on how you use the words and how you, I think it's important though, because it causes people to be related and to be connected to one another through language. And if you know those nuances and those connections, it makes it so powerful and so rich when you're talking to your relatives and you're talking to the people. I just love to hear Lakota language speakers because they sound so beautiful. It's just, you know, it makes my heart just happy. And I think that's what languages should do. They should raise people up, hold people up, and encourage people. And that's what I like to hear other languages do that for one another. Ta-da, done.
Alas. Thank you for that. That was very insightful. One of the things you said, you know, when you were talking about how the different words you have for relationships, they have different levels of meaning and different ways that it causes you to think about that person. And it called to mind a very interesting experience I had when I was living in West Africa, and I went to live with this guy when I was like learning local culture, and I went to stay with a guy who was a kind of, we call sous chef. In other words, he was an important guy. He wasn't the chief, but he was like an important guy, mostly because he was prosperous, right? Anyway, I went to stay with him, and he had a whole bunch of wives. I lost count. But they had like a whole courtyard, and each wife had her own place, and you know, her place that she lives and everything, and they live in the courthouse. And so we had a conversation about, you know, multiple wives. And he said, you know, in our culture, when we say wife, it has a different meaning than in your culture. And he said, for example, my mother is my wife, and I refer to her as my wife. And he said, because, or it's a translation in your language as wife. He said, but when a person, if my brother dies, I'm expected to take care of his wife and the mother of his children and his children. And when my father dies, I'm expected to take care of my mother because I'm the oldest son. He said, so in our culture, a wife means someone that, if I say that's my wife, it's someone that I take responsibility for. I take responsibility for that person's survival. That person comes under my roof. And if you have an issue, if anybody has an issue with that woman, they do not take it to that woman. They come to me. If my wife cusses out the butcher, he can't slap her. He has to come to me and tell me, then I slap her. You know, but he can't do that, you know, because she's my wife. So it's like it was a eye opener, because it was like, okay, different people have a word that we translate to that, but culturally it means something completely different. And speaking of different, we've come to the end of our illustrious period here. I thank all of the people who contributed and those who listened as well. And I hope you'll join us again next week, and we'll continue having more insightful conversations. And as they say in the street, bring it. You know. Okay. See you next week. Same time, same station.
Bye, folks.
Bye.
Moksha.